This short essay, What I Have Lived For, appeared as a prologue to Bertrand Russell's autobiography published in 1951. Three passions, simple but overwhelmingly strong, have governed my life: the longing for love, the search for knowledge, and unbearable pity for the suffering of humankind. These passions, like great winds, have blown me hither and thither in a wayward course over a deep ocean of anguish, reaching to the very verge of despair. I have sought love first because it brings ecstasy. Ecstasy so great that I would often have sacrificed all the rest of life for a few hours of this joy. I have sought it next because it relieves loneliness, that terrible loneliness in which one shivering consciousness looks over the rim of the world into the cold, unfathomable, lifeless abyss. I have sought it finally because in the union of love I have seen in mystic miniature the prefiguring vision of the heaven that saints and poets have imagined. This is what I sought, and thought it might seem too good for human life. This is what, at last, I have found. With equal passion, I have sought knowledge. I have wished to understand the hearts of other people. I have wished to know why the stars shine, and I have tried to apprehend the Pythagorean power by which number holds sway above the flux. A little of this, but not much, I have achieved. Love and knowledge, so far as they were possible, led upward toward the heavens, but always pity brought me back to earth. Echoes of cries of pain reverberate in my heart. Children in famine, victims tortured by their oppressors, helpless old people, a hated burden to their children. And the whole world of loneliness, poverty, and pain make a mockery of what human life should be. I long to alleviate the evil, but I cannot, and I too suffer. This has been my life. I have found it worth living and would gladly live it again if the chance were offered me.
I was really impressed with that reading. I just hope the sermon is somewhat as good. The inspiration for this actually came from my thinking about two things. One was my summer vacation, which it's time to plan summer vacations. And the second is remembering my father, who died 2 years ago. He had a particular idea of what a summer vacation should be. And we'd rent a place on Cape Cod and go to the shore for 2 weeks. And he would bring along Willard Van Orman Quine's book, Mathematical Logic. And he would sit at the dining room table in the cottage and go through the proofs that Quine had laid out page after page. And he had a huge notebook of his going through the proofs and making sure that they made sense to him. And the rest of us played outside. But this was his idea of fun, I think. So I want to start with a line that from Groucho Marx. He was one of the Marx brothers, a film star, vaudeville fellow, and everything else. He sent a telegram to the Friars Club of Beverly Hills once upon a time, saying, "Please accept my resignation. I don't care to belong to any club that will have me as a member." Groucho was pretty good about finding the humorous in life. But of course, when you think about it, it really wasn't all that funny, because he and his entire family were Jewish and excluded from many of the social clubs, many of the seats of power in the country at that time, just as women and people of color were excluded, and in some ways still are excluded. So if you follow his philosophy, he couldn't join any club at all. And maybe that's just the way he liked it, but if it wasn't, he was still really stuck with the problem that this world is paradoxical. You know, vaudeville was full of clowns, people who said funny things and people laughed and whatever, and they went away. But I think Groucho was more of a jester. He was someone who had people's ear when they came to see his movies, when they came to see the vaudeville show. But that enabled him to speak truth, which not necessarily at that moment sunk in, but at some point actually made people think about social stratification and things like that. Now, the good reason that I could bring in Groucho Marx was that Bertrand Russell in 1901 came up with a paradox that in some ways was similar to the idea of not wanting to join any club that would have him as a member. But Bertrand Russell was a man of incredible privilege. He was the grandson of the Earl Russell, and in his later years he was a peer in the House of Lords. He wasn't the outsider for anything. So I don't think that there's this little social strata to his words, because he was a formal mathematician. Now, this is going to be the strangest thing ever done in a sermon. I'm going to explain a little bit of set theory to you all. Sets can be different types. There can be what's called finite sets that have a certain number of elements. The set of all people in this room is a finite set. The set of all hymns in the hymnal is a finite set. And then there can be infinite sets, like the set of all integers, the set of all prime numbers, the set of all multiples of 10. And then there can be sets that have other sets. So the sets of all members of all congregations, each congregation is a set. There are a bunch of different ones, and that's finite. There's only so many congregations and so many people in each one of them. But you could also have, for example, the set of all infinite sets, which would have all the integers, it would have all the multiples of 10, it would have all the different ways of making eggs. I don't know. It would be an infinite number of possible things. And oddly enough, the set of infinite sets contains the set of infinite sets. So it has itself as a member. Okay. And if that isn't mind-blowing enough, Russell proposed that there was a set that contained all sets that don't contain themselves as members. Okay. Now the question is the set of all sets that are not members themselves a member of itself or not a member of itself? And so with formal logic theory, not just the little sort of quip that we had on the cover of our order of service, he proved that set theory is inconsistent, which was kind of upsetting to the mathematicians at the beginning of the 20th century who were busily proving things based on formal set theory and thinking that they now understood what the world was all about because they understood mathematics. And here was a formal proof that mathematics could not be understood. Any system that contained the integers this basic set theory was inconsistent with itself. Now, the world of paradox shows up in our lives, shows up in the lives of society quite a bit. And one of the more common paradoxes is, does God exist? You knew it's a sermon. You knew I had to bring God into it somehow. Especially, does a God who is both omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent exist? That means God knows everything, God can do anything, and God wants to help. So, if you can imagine that God, then the question is, why does suffering exist? Why do horrible things happen to good people? Why didn't God help? Now, the whole Enlightenment thing, a bunch of people came up with this thing called theodicy. Leibniz came up with an argument to defend God, because God needed defending at this point. And he came up with the idea that evil can be accompanied by a greater good. So the fact that, for example, if a general sends out troops into the battlefield, that's the only way to achieve victory, is to actually risk people's lives. So the greater good is the victory. And Leibniz also said that original sin was a happy sin. I'm not sure I agree with that one. I think that is something that a lot of people you meet every day in the shopping center line actually believe, but I'm not one of them. And then there's this guy, Kurt Gödel, who actually lived in Princeton, New Jersey, which is just down the road from where I used to live, and I actually know his plumber. But Kurt Gödel came up with this remarkable proof that said any system that contains arithmetic, that you can describe the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 integers, will also contain theorems that you can't prove whether they're true or not, but they're true. You can't prove it, but they're true. And so those are undecidable questions. And some people think that the whole concept of God thing is one of those undecidable things. You can't prove that it's true, you can't prove that it's false. And I'm going to come back in a moment to Bertrand Russell. But I want to give you, instead of the order of service, I want to give you this statement. Okay. It says, this statement is true. And the question for you is this statement true? If it's true, then it's true. But there's another possibility. If it's false, it's false. And so while we automatically went to the idea that a statement like this is obviously true because it says it's true, you could also go to the place that said it's obviously false because everything starts out being false until it can be proven true. And that's where we come back to Bertrand Russell, who was a confirmed atheist. He proposed that he made a statement. He said, somewhere in space between the orbit of Earth and the orbit of Mars, there is a teapot that is circling the sun. And it's so small that there's no radar that we have, no telescope that could possibly see this teapot. But it's out there. Now, how many of you think that there's actually a teapot out there? Raise your hands. Okay, and how many of you think there isn't a teapot out there? And how many of you don't know? What's interesting is that he then asked, so, do the people who don't believe in the teapot have to prove that the teapot doesn't exist? Or do the people who believe in the teapot have to believe it exists? And that's a really interesting question. So if everybody's always believed in God, and God is sort of like that teapot, you can't sense him, you can't anything else, you can't prove any theorems about him, does he exist because people believe in him, or does he not exist because you can't prove that he exists? So is the burden of proof on those who don't believe in God or on those who do believe in God? Well, kind of a cool thing. Going through his autobiography, it was not easy writing the sermon because I kept coming up with new things that were just so cool to think about. Unfortunately, really hard to explain in a sermon. But it did make me think, and his prologue made me think, is my world really full of paradoxes? Do I have statements like this? Do I have things like Russell's teapot that are just there in my world? Are they in your world? Do you regularly accept things that really aren't, if you've thought about them in formal logic, they actually end up being, they could just absorb all your time and all your energy? Do we believe things like Zeno's paradox here, that it must have been Debbie who won the race because we could prove it, when we know full well that Rudy was going to get to that side first? They're just questions to sit with. Now one of the things that I also wanted to talk just a minute or two about is chaos. The idea that everything isn't actually neat, that there isn't a theorem at the base of life, that the laws of physics are models of what reality is. And actually chaos goes much farther than that, but it's a cute story. It is the story that once upon a time, and at MIT, of course, there was a guy with a really lousy computer, and he decided he wanted to predict the weather. So he came up with a few parameters, pressure and temperature and relative humidity and things like that, and created a computer program that then used those things to predict whether it was going to rain or not. And if it rained, then it cooled down the ground and things like that. So you had to figure out what would happen in the future to the temperature and the humidity and the air pressure and the like. And so he had this little model, and he said, well, this is cool. So he started running it, and he'd say, well, this is what the weather's going to be like tomorrow and the next day and the next day. And he'd print out the numbers for each of these values. One day he said, well, what happens, let's try that one again. And he took the typed out numbers, put them back in again, and ran it, and the result was different. What happened was that even though they had lots of decimal places in the numbers, there were little tiny errors between the representation in the computer and what got printed out. And those little tiny errors slowly grew and grew and grew, and the weather changed to something completely different a week later, according to this model. That's like, how can something so small give you such a different result? And the model is sort of like saying, if there's a butterfly in the Amazon that happens to flap its wings an extra time and create a little breeze, will that breeze eventually cause a hurricane? And if the hurricane was one of those two branches and the butterfly was that little round-off error, will that round-off error cause the divergence of weather between those two systems? And so that's one part of chaos theory. The other is that the weather predictions in both cases were basically the same. It never got to 300 degrees Fahrenheit, and it never froze clear down to China. It was just always in this range, but it was chaotic. It would go someplace else. And so he sort of said, well, we sort of know what the weather's going to be in July. It's going to be summer-like weather, right? Speaking of vacations, it's going to be sort of summer-like. But we don't know what the weather's going to be in July. So we can sort of understand things about it without actually knowing. We can't prove anything, but we got a feeling for what's going on. And one of the other results of this understanding of chaotic theory of weather forecasting certainly was that the whole concept of seeding clouds, I don't know if any of you remember they were flying planes over and seeding clouds to make rain and whatever. You go, well, that changes that, but that change may change something else and change something else, and it could cause a hurricane, even though all you thought were you're going to make a little bit of rain for your crops. Now, getting back to Bertrand Russell, just briefly, was that during World War I, he was a pacifist and was actually imprisoned for the duration of the war in England for his pacifism. But after World War II, he gave a speech where he proposed that because the Russians were working on getting an atomic bomb, that the Allies should invade Russia and make sure that they stopped. So he actually proposed doing an invasion because he didn't want there to be two sides with nuclear weapons, with atomic weapons and later nuclear weapons. And well, I guess it's good news. What happened was that people said, hey, you're supposed to be a pacifist. We're not going to listen to you. And he gave a lot of speeches about atomic arms control and things like that in the 50s when it was not popular. Came to the U.S. and was branded as a communist and kicked out of the country and the like. But he'd gone from being this complete pacifist to being this sort of preemptive strike guy. And yet, within his logical system, they both made sense, at least at one time. Sometimes somebody finally, after a few years, he said, you know, that was really a dumb idea. And he stopped proposing it. But actually what happened was that the Russians actually got nuclear weapons, and so it was too late then. But the fact is that we can't really know the future. We can't use formal logic to know the future. We just have ourselves. And that sort of goes back to the reading, which I have to admit was better organized because Bertrand Russell was an excellent speaker and got the Nobel Prize for Literature and everything else. But there really are three things that it boils down to. And I'm going to give them in a different order. The first one is learning. Learn as much as you can about the world. The second one is that the world is full of suffering. There are truly awful things that happen to good people. And the third one is that love can make us feel whole, help us to carry on. And it's something that we could conceivably give our lives for. And that is in itself paradoxical. Amen.